growing scandal involving Prince Harry and his last remaining genuine charity project, the Invictus Games. But is it really a charity project at all?
For a foundation that runs almost entirely on donations from ordinary people, that is not a footnote buried on page 9 of a filing. That is the entire operation, frozen overnight. Without warning, within hours, it was everywhere. Every royal correspondent on earth was asking some version of the same question. What happened to the Sussex's charity? Why has it suddenly been barred from raising money? I want you to picture a filing cabinet, not a crime scene. A filing cabinet in an office in Beverly Hills that almost nobody has ever opened. Inside it sits a piece of paper, a tax form, 9 pages long, filed once a year, like clockwork, since 2020.
She still doesn't understand there's a huge difference between royalty and celebrity. I think she's stunned by the fact that members of the royal family don't have agents.
And on that form, year after year, the same 2 names appear in the same 2 boxes. Not 5 names. Not 7. 2. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. And Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. That's the entire governing board of a charity that has raised more than $20 million since it began. Let that sit for a second. Because here's what nobody tells you about charities. It's not the scandal that gets them into trouble. It's the paperwork. The boring, unglamorous paperwork that almost nobody reads until it's too late. This is a story about paperwork. Hi viewers, quick question before we go further. Have you ever donated to a cause because of who was asking, without checking where the money actually went? Just answer yes or no in the comments. Because that question sits at the center of everything I'm about to walk you through. In 2020, in the middle of a global pandemic, a new organization was born. It called itself the Archewell Foundation. Named, in part, for a little boy. Archie. The mission statement was warm, uplifting, community, compassion, one act of kindness at a time. And for a while, that's all anyone needed to hear. Money poured in. $13 million in the very first year alone. Small donations, mostly. Ordinary people, giving what they could, trusting a name they recognized from magazine covers and news alerts. But here's the thing about trust. It's easy to give. It's much harder to verify. Most people who give $5 or $50 or $500 never open a tax filing. They never check a board roster. They never ask who's actually signing off on where the money goes. Why would they? The name on the door was enough. And for 4 years, it was. Then, in the spring of 2024, a letter landed on that foundation's desk that nobody saw coming. It came from the office of the Attorney General of California.
There's a lot that I can forgive, but there needs to be conversations, and then in order for reconciliation, and part of that has to be accountability.
The words on it were cold, bureaucratic, and absolutely devastating if you understood what they meant. Delinquent. That was the word. Not from a tabloid. Not from a rival royal correspondent. From the state itself. A charity, the letter said, was no longer permitted to raise money. Not $1 more. Not until it fixed what it had broken. For a foundation built almost entirely on the goodwill of small, ordinary donors, that single word landed like a verdict. Within hours, it was everywhere. Every royal reporter on earth was asking the exact same question. What happened to the Sussex's charity? And the answers that came back were strange. Contradictory. Some called it nothing at all, a clerical hiccup, gone by Friday. Others called it a warning sign nobody should ignore. Even the governor of California weighed in personally, calling the entire episode overblown. That assumption sat quietly, unexamined, for 4 full years. Until a single envelope, mailed from a government office, forced the question out into the open. I've spent the past several weeks going through every public filing this organization has ever submitted. Every tax form, every state registration record, every Watchdog report written about it since the day it opened its doors. And what I found wasn't a single scandal, wrapped up neatly with a villain and a resolution. It was something slower. A pattern of small, repeated gaps, stretched out across 5 years, that only becomes visible once you stop looking at any one headline in isolation and start looking at the entire timeline at once. That's what this video is going to do. Piece by piece. Document by document. In order.
For me, having seen my family and the institution's part in constantly feeding the British press with lies, mistruths, disinformation.
Stay with me, because some of what's in that timeline never made it into a single news segment anywhere. I want to be upfront about something, because it matters for everything that follows. Nothing you're about to hear tonight is speculation. I'm not going to describe a crime. I'm not going to name a villain and hand you a verdict wrapped in a bow. What I'm going to do is show you documents. Public ones. Filed with the IRS. Filed with the state of California. Reviewed and reported on by a non-profit watchdog that has no political stake in any of this, and whose entire job is simply to read what organizations put on paper and check it against what they claim in public. Some of it will feel small on its own. A missing signature here. A vague line item there. One quiet gap in a state database that almost nobody noticed at the time it happened. But stack those small things together, in the right order, across the right timeline, and a much clearer picture starts to form. Not proof of a crime. Something more like a shape. A pattern, hiding in plain sight, inside documents that were always technically public, and almost never actually read. That's the story I'm going to walk you through tonight, one document at a time. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the letter. Before the headlines. Before any of it became a story people argued about online. 2020. A pandemic year. A new foundation, built almost overnight, with a warm mission statement and a famous name attached to it. And 2 signatures on every piece of paper it ever filed. Just 2. Here's what almost nobody asked out loud at the time. Is 2 enough? Think about how most serious charities are actually structured. A board of 5 people, at minimum. That number isn't arbitrary.
Well, there is some trouble brewing with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's charity, and to fill us in, we have Sarah Nathan, editor-at-large from the New York Post. Welcome.
Hi. Hello.
So what's going on?
Well, early this morning, we got a tip.
It's considered the baseline for basic accountability in the non-profit world. And ideally, a majority of that board should be independent. People with no financial stake in the outcome. People whose entire job is to ask the uncomfortable question nobody else wants to ask. Archewell never had that. From its very first tax filing to its most recent one, the governing board has consisted of exactly 2 people. The same 2 people who founded the organization. The same 2 people whose names sit at the top of the mission statement. The same 2 people who, in effect, approve their own decisions year after year, with no outside vote in the room to slow them down. I want you to actually sit with that for a second. Because let me be precise here. It is not against the law to run a small charity with a 2-person board. Plenty of small, well-run organizations do exactly that. But legal and accountable are not always the same word. A non-profit watchdog group based in Chicago, called CharityWatch, has made exactly that argument, publicly, for years. Their reasoning is simple, and honestly, hard to argue with. When the people running an organization are also the only people voting on how it's run, there is no one left in the room whose job is to say no. No one to challenge a budget line. No one to flag a strange expense before it becomes a filing. No one, structurally, whose entire purpose is to disagree. And that's just the board. That's before we even get to the audits. So let's talk about the letters. 3 of them, over 3 years, each one asking for the exact same thing. Starting in January of 2024, CharityWatch sent a written request to the foundation. It was simple. Direct. Please send us a copy of your independent audit. That detail matters more than it might seem to at first.
So do we have an idea as to when the check is going to be delivered?
Apparently very, very soon. So this should be rectified. Apparently they're saying it should be rectified within 7 days, 7 business days.
It means this isn't a story about a handful of wealthy patrons quietly funding a pet project and asking no questions. It's a story about thousands of regular people, moved by a name, a mission statement, and a sense that their small contribution was going somewhere that mattered. Those are the people a two-person board is ultimately accountable to. Those are the people an unanswered audit request is, in the end, keeping in the dark. Not a handful of insiders. All of us. The teacher who gave $20 because a headline moved her. The retiree who gave $50 because he liked what the mission statement promised. The stranger on the other side of the world who gave whatever he could spare, trusting that someone, somewhere, was watching where it landed. That trust is the actual currency here, not the $20 million. The trust that made the $20 million possible in the first place. So hold that thought steady. The board of two. The audit that was promised, but never once produced. Because in a moment, we're going to see exactly what happened when a completely different institution, a state government this time, decided it had waited long enough for an answer of its own. The letter came in May of 2024. It was short. Procedural. The kind of document that reads like it was written by a machine, not a person. And it was devastating if you understood what it actually meant. The Attorney General's Office for the State of California had reviewed the Foundation's charitable registration and found something missing. Incomplete renewal paperwork. An annual filing fee, left unpaid. The consequence was immediate. Automatic. Under state law, an organization in that position is barred from soliciting or spending charitable funds until the issue is formally resolved. Barred. Not warned. Not flagged for review next quarter. Barred, effective immediately. For a foundation that runs almost entirely on donations from ordinary people, that is not a footnote buried on page 9 of a filing. That is the entire operation, frozen overnight, without warning. Within hours, it was everywhere. Every royal correspondent on Earth was asking some version of the same question. What happened to the Sussex's charity? Why has it suddenly been barred from raising money? A spokesperson for the foundation responded quickly. The statement was confident, almost dismissive. They said the organization remained fully compliant. They said all necessary payments had been made, promptly and correctly. They said, in their own words, there had been no error and no wrongdoing. Then something happened that nobody quite expected. California's own governor was asked about it directly at an unrelated press event focused on an entirely different issue. And he didn't dodge the question. He leaned into it. He called the entire episode a technical paperwork issue. He said, publicly, on the record, that it had been wildly overhyped. Within days, the state confirmed it. The foundation was back in good standing. The registration was current. The bar on fundraising was lifted. Crisis over. Story closed. Everyone moved on to the next headline. Except one detail sat there quietly, and almost nobody followed up on it. The Attorney General's office never actually explained when it first discovered the lapse. It never released a timeline showing how long the registration had been expired before that letter finally went out. Was it days? Weeks? Longer? Nobody said. And almost nobody asked. A resolved problem is not the same thing as an explained one. Those are two different outcomes, and it's worth being precise about which one we actually got. We got resolved. We never got explained. And that gap between resolved and explained is exactly where this part of the story earns its tension. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about how this moment played out in public. Within roughly 48 hours, an entire international news cycle went from alarm to defense, to resolution, to silence. Headlines that once used the word delinquent were replaced almost overnight with headlines using the word resolved. But the underlying documents didn't change. The registration lapse happened. The letter was real. The bar on fundraising was real for however many days it lasted. Those facts don't disappear just because the news cycle decided to move on from them. What also didn't disappear was the pattern underneath it. Because this wasn't actually the only time the Foundation's California registration would come into question. According to CharityWatch's more recent reporting, the registration appears to have lapsed again, around May of 2025, roughly a year after the first incident made headlines. And as of the most recent check of California's public database, the most current filing on record for the organization was for its fiscal year ending in 2023. Meaning, according to the Watchdog's own review, more recent filings simply were not reflected in the state system at all. Once could be an accident. A lost check in the mail, exactly as a source close to the Foundation described it at the time. Twice starts to look like something else. Not proof of wrongdoing. Nobody sensible would claim that. But a pattern. A recurring gap in the exact same category of basic administrative compliance. And patterns, in this kind of story, matter more than any single headline ever could. So where does that leave us at the end of this chapter? A foundation that was publicly declared delinquent by a state government in 2024. A foundation that was cleared within days and defended personally by a sitting governor. And a foundation that, by a Watchdog's own later account, appears to have lapsed again the following year, this time with far less media attention paid to it. One incident makes headlines. A second one, quieter and less examined, might tell you more about what's actually happening underneath. Let's slow down for a moment on what a charity registration actually is, because the word delinquent only lands with full force once you understand what it protects. Every state that allows charitable solicitation requires organizations to register, renew that registration annually, and pay a modest fee to remain in good standing. It sounds almost too small to matter. A couple $100. A form. A signature. But that small, unglamorous requirement is one of the only real checkpoints a state government has to confirm a charity still exists, is still operating, and is still accountable to public oversight. It's not a formality invented to trip up well-meaning organizations. It's one of the few moments each year when a non-profit is required to actively check in with the government overseeing it. Miss that checkpoint, and the state has no reliable way of knowing whether an organization soliciting money from the public is even still in compliance with the most basic rules governing it. That's why the penalty is so blunt. Not a warning. Not a fine that quietly gets paid later. An immediate bar on raising or spending charitable funds until the organization proves it's still playing by the rules. Now, here's where the human side of this story gets interesting. A source close to the foundation, speaking anonymously at the time, offered an explanation that sounded almost mundane. A check, they said, had been lost in the mail. A simple administrative mishap, nothing more. The kind of thing that happens to organizations of every size, every single year. And that's entirely plausible. Lost mail happens. Administrative oversights happen even to well-run organizations with every intention of following the rules. But here's the detail that keeps this story from fully closing, no matter how plausible that explanation sounds. The renewal deadline the foundation missed wasn't a surprise. It wasn't buried in fine print or delivered without warning. Annual charity renewals in California follow a fixed, well-known schedule, the same one every registered charity in the state operates under, year after year. Which means whatever caused the lapse, whether it was a lost check, an internal miscommunication, or something else entirely, it happened despite a deadline that both the foundation and any competent non-profit administrator working for it would have known was coming months in advance. I'm not saying that makes it suspicious. I am saying it makes the lost check explanation slightly less simple than it first sounds. And here's the detail that almost nobody outside of specialized non-profit reporting seems to have noticed at all. This wasn't a one-time stumble that got corrected and never repeated. according to CharityWatch's more recent findings, gathered well over a year after the 2024 incident made global headlines, the same category of problem appears to have resurfaced. The Foundation's California registration reportedly lapsed again, this time without anywhere near the same level of public attention. No Attorney General's office issuing a public notice this time, at least not one that made headlines. No governor stepping in to publicly defend the organization. Just a quiet gap in the state's own public database, sitting there, unexplained, for anyone patient enough to go looking for it. Compare that to the first incident. When the 2024 lapse became public, it triggered an immediate, coordinated response. A same-day spokesperson statement. A public defense from a sitting governor. Resolution within days, confirmed by the state itself. The second lapse, by contrast, appears to have simply happened and simply sat there without triggering anything close to the same reaction. Maybe that's because nobody with a media platform was watching closely enough the second time to notice. Maybe it's because, once the cameras move on, so does everyone else's attention, including, perhaps, an organization's own sense of urgency around basic compliance deadlines. Either way, the pattern is there in the public record, whether anyone chose to look at it or not. 2 lapses. One loud, one quiet. Same category of failure, roughly a year apart. And it's exactly that kind of repetition that turns a single news cycle into something else entirely. A pattern worth tracking. A question worth returning to, long after everyone else has changed the subject. So we're going to change the subject too, but only for a moment, and only to follow the money itself, straight into the filings nobody but a watchdog group ever seems to actually read line by line. While the internet was busy deciding whether a paperwork lapse was a scandal or nothing at all, almost nobody was actually looking at the money itself. So let's look at it now. Slowly. Number by number. In its very first year, 2021, the foundation raised just over $13 million. An extraordinary number for a brand new organization. Small donations, mostly, from people all over the world, moved by a name and a mission statement that promised something simple. Show up. Do good. The very next year, that number collapsed. Contributions fell to just over $2 million. A drop of more than 80% in a single 12-month period. Now, on its own, a decline like that isn't automatically a red flag. First-year numbers for brand new charities are often inflated by launch attention, a wave of media coverage, and an initial surge of goodwill that naturally settles once the news cycle moves on. That happens to legitimate organizations constantly. But here's where the story gets more specific and a little harder to explain away. By the 2024 tax filing, the most recent one publicly available, the foundation again reported raising a little over $2 million for the year. Except this time, $2 million of that total came from a single donor. One name. One check. The overwhelming majority of an entire year's fundraising total from one source. Meanwhile, in that same 12-month period, the foundation spent just over $5 million. More than double what it actually raised that year. Where did the difference come from? Reserves. Money saved during the stronger, earlier years, now being drawn down to cover a widening gap between what's coming in and what's going out. The foundation's net assets, essentially its total financial cushion, fell from close to $11 million down to just over $8 million in that single 12-month window. That's not collapse. Let me be clear about that. $8 million in reserves is still a substantial financial position for an organization of this size. But it is a foundation spending noticeably faster than it's bringing new money in, year after year, for several years running now. And here's the detail that made a watchdog group stop scrolling and start writing. When you break down exactly how that $5 million was actually spent, nearly half of it, 47% of all program spending for that year, was logged under a single accounting line. Just labeled, simply, other. Not education. Not direct aid to families. Not travel expenses, or event costs, or grants distributed to partner organizations. categories that most charities break out individually, specifically so the public can actually see where the money went. Other. A supporting schedule attached to the filing offered slightly more detail, but not much. It described the expense only as, quote, outside program consultants. That's it. That's the entire explanation on record. Nearly half of 1 year's entire program budget, described in 2 words, on 1 line, in 1 schedule, attached to 1 filing most people will never open. I want to be careful here, because precision matters more in this chapter than almost any other. I am not going to tell you that vague expense category is, by itself, evidence of wrongdoing. It isn't, on its own. Vague accounting categories exist across the non-profit sector more often than most people realize. Consulting fees, contractor payments, and outside services are notoriously difficult to itemize cleanly on a public tax form, and plenty of well-run charities use broad categories like this one for entirely mundane reasons. But I am going to tell you this. When an organization is already facing scrutiny over a 2-person board with no independent oversight, when that same organization has already failed to produce an audit it claims exists across 3 separate written requests spanning 3 years, when that organization has already drawn public attention over not 1, but 2 separate lapses in basic state registration, and then, on top of all of that, chooses to describe 47% of an entire year's spending in 2 words instead of 10 lines of detail. That's not a coincidence anyone should simply wave away. It's a pattern. And patterns are exactly what a trained watchdog is built to notice, even when no single piece of it, taken alone, would raise much of an eyebrow. There's something else worth sitting with here, something almost nobody talks about when they cover stories like this one. Averages lie. They smooth over the exact details that actually matter. If you looked only at the average of Archewell's total contributions across its first 4 years, roughly $5.5 million annually, you'd assume a fairly stable, consistently funded organization. But that average is deeply misleading, and deliberately so if you don't dig into the individual years behind it. One single year, the very first one, accounts for well over half of the entire 4-year total. Strip that first year out, and the remaining 3 years combined raised less than $10 million total. Barely more than $3 million a year, on average, for an organization managing 8-figure reserves and issuing press statements about global humanitarian work. That's the real shape of the story. Not steady growth. Not a thriving, expanding operation. A massive initial wave of public goodwill in year 1, followed by a slow, steady decline that's been quietly continuing ever since, propped up now by reserves built during that first extraordinary year, and increasingly reliant on a small handful of large individual donors rather than the broad public support the organization was originally built on. None of this, again, proves fraud. None of this has been confirmed as criminal wrongdoing by any court, regulator, or government body, and I want that stated plainly, without hedging. But it does raise a question that deserves a real answer, not a rebrand, and not a press statement. If nearly half a year's spending sits behind 2 vague words on a public filing, who, exactly, is checking that description against the actual invoices behind it? With a board of 2, the answer, structurally, might be nobody at all. Let's put actual numbers side by side, because comparison is where a vague line item stops being abstract and starts feeling real. 47% of 1 year's program spending, filed under Other, works out to well over $2 million. $2 million, moving through an organization, described in a public tax document using 2 words and nothing more. For comparison, that single unexplained figure is roughly equal to the entire amount raised from the general public that same year, once you exclude the 1 large individual donor who accounted for the bulk of total contributions. Sit with that for a second. The public gave a certain amount. A separate, unexplained expense line absorbed a comparable amount. 2 numbers of similar size, one raised transparently through public generosity, the other spent behind a label that tells you almost nothing. I keep returning to a simple, almost naive question. What would it actually take to fix this? Not headlines. Not a rebrand. Not a spokesperson's statement calling criticism unfair or overblown. just a slightly longer line item. A short paragraph in a supporting schedule breaking outside program consultants into actual categories. Legal fees. Communication support. Event production. Whatever it actually is. Charities far smaller than this one manage that level of detail every single year, without controversy, without watchdog letters, without any of this. So why hasn't it happened here? Maybe it's simple oversight. Maybe whoever prepares these filings genuinely doesn't see the need for more detail, given how much latitude tax authorities generally allow around broad expense categories. Or maybe, and this is the far less comfortable possibility, more detail was never provided because more detail was never actually required by anyone, structurally, inside the organization itself. Remember the board. 2 people. No independent vote. No outside committee reviewing expense categories before they're finalized and filed. When nobody with independent standing is required to ask a question, that question, quite often, simply never gets asked. That's not proof of anything hidden. I want to say that clearly, one more time, because it matters. It's a structural observation, not an accusation. But it's exactly the kind of structural gap that turns a routine accounting choice into the center of a 3-year-old, still unresolved argument between a charity and the watchdog group trying to hold it accountable. And that argument is about to bring us right back to the one document that could settle almost all of it in a single afternoon if it was simply produced. The audit. The one requested in writing 3 separate times, across 3 separate years, and never once delivered. Let's bring it back to where this entire story actually starts. Not with a scandal. With a request. January 2024. A letter goes out from a small watchdog office in Chicago. Please send us a copy of your independent audit. That's all it asks. Nothing happens. December, that same year. A second letter. Same question, worded almost identically. Nothing happens again. January 2026. A third letter. Mailed, on paper, through the postal service, exactly like the first 2. As of the date the request was last reviewed, still nothing. 3 requests. 3 separate years. 0 documents. I want you to notice something about the shape of that timeline, because it tells you something the individual letters can't tell you on their own. This isn't a single oversight. It isn't a letter that got lost once, in one bad year. It's the same request, sent 3 separate times, spread out across roughly 24 months, and met with the exact same silence every single time. If a genuine mistake explained the first missed response, what explains the second? And if some unlucky coincidence explained the second, what exactly explains the third? At some point, silence stops being an accident. It starts being an answer, whether anyone intended it that way or not. And here's where the story takes its final turn, because right around the same period all of this was unfolding, the organization changed its name. Late in 2025, Archewell Foundation became Archewell Philanthropies. A new name. Likely a new logo. A softer, more polished version of the same organization the public had already been asking questions about for 2 straight years. But according to the very watchdog that had spent that entire time requesting answers, nothing structural changed along with it. The same 2-person board remained exactly in place. The audit that had never arrived, still never arrived. And around that same window of time, the Foundation's registration with the state of California appears to have lapsed once again, quietly, with the most recent filing on record in that state's public database dating back to fiscal year 2023. A new name. The very same open questions, sitting underneath it, completely unresolved. I want to be precise, one final time, because precision has been the entire point of this story from its very first sentence. Nothing you've heard tonight proves a crime took place. Nothing here has been confirmed as fraud by any court, any regulator, or any government body, and nobody credible is claiming otherwise. A resolved paperwork lapse is not a conviction. A vague expense line is not a confession. A two-person board is not, by itself, evidence of anything improper. What we actually have is something quieter, and in its own way, more uncomfortable to sit with. A charity that asks the public for trust, built on a governance structure that was never designed to be independently checked. An audit that supposedly exists, according to the organization's own filings, and has never once been shown to the people formally asking for it. A rebrand that changed a name, but never touched the structure underneath it. 2 separate registration lapses in 2 separate years, one loud, one nearly silent. None of that is a verdict. All of it is a pattern. So here's the question I'll leave you with tonight, the same one that's been sitting underneath this entire story since the very first letter went unanswered. If an organization genuinely has nothing to hide, what does it actually cost them to show their work? 1 email. 1 attachment. 3 years, and counting, of silence instead. That gap is still open tonight. Nobody has closed it. Not the foundation. Not the state of California. Not the Watchdog group still checking its mailbox. Maybe the 4th letter gets a response. Maybe it doesn't. Either way, I'll be watching for it, and so, now, will you? Because next time, we're going even further back, into the exact language buried inside an earlier tax filing, where a single decision, made by just 2 people, quietly moved more money through this organization than most of its donors ever knew to ask about. I've already read that document. And there's one line in it, buried on page 6, that changes how everything else in this story should be read. You're going to want to see it for yourself. Before we get there, though, I want to leave you with something a little different than a headline. Something closer to the actual truth of stories like this one. Most people who followed this story only ever saw 3 moments of it. The delinquency notice splashed across a news cycle for about 48 hours. A governor's quick dismissal of it. And then silence as everyone moved on to the next thing competing for their attention. What almost nobody saw was everything underneath those 48 hours. 3 years of quiet, unanswered letters. 2 separate registration lapses instead of 1. A donation base that shrank by more than 80% and never fully recovered. An accounting line covering nearly half a year's spending, described in exactly 2 words. None of that fits neatly into a 48-hour news cycle. It doesn't have a single dramatic headline attached to it. It's not a scandal with a clean beginning, middle, and end. It's slower than that. Quieter than that. And in a strange way, that's exactly why it deserves more attention, not less. Because the loud stories, the ones with a single dramatic headline and a tidy resolution, are usually the ones that get checked. Reporters chase them. Governments respond to them publicly, the way California's did within days. The pressure of visibility does some of the accountability work on its own. It's the quiet stories, the 2nd registration lapse nobody covered, the 3rd unanswered letter that barely made the news, the accounting line that sat there for over a year before a watchdog group flagged it, that tend to go unexamined the longest. Silence isn't neutral. It's just harder to notice. So if there's one thing worth taking away from everything you've just heard, let it be this. Trust is not a renewable resource that regenerates on its own, simply because enough time passes without a fresh headline. It has to be actively maintained, through documents that get produced when they're requested, through structures built to include people outside the immediate circle of founders, through the unglamorous, boring paperwork that almost nobody wants to read, but that exists specifically to protect the people who can't personally audit an organization themselves. The donors who gave $20 because a mission statement moved them were never going to read a 9-page tax filing. They were never going to notice a lapsed registration in a state database, or a vague line item buried in a supporting schedule. That's exactly why those structures are supposed to exist independently of them. Not as an insult to the organization being asked to comply. As a basic form of respect for the people whose trust made the entire operation possible in the first place. Whether that respect has been fully honored here is still an open question tonight. 3 years, 2 lapses, and 1 unproduced audit into this story. I don't have a tidy answer for you. Nobody does yet, not even the watchdog group that's been asking longest. What I have is a promise. I'm not done pulling on this thread. Somewhere between a lost check in the mail and a name change nobody fully explained, there's a real answer waiting. Not a conspiracy. Not a cover-up in the dramatic sense. Just an organization that owes the people who trusted it something it hasn't yet delivered. Clarity. Until that clarity shows up in the form of an actual audit, an actual expense breakdown, an actual answer to 3 years of unanswered letters, this story stays open. And I'll be right here, watching the mailbox with everyone else.